go.
Greetings from the University of Kentucky. My name is Patrick Lee Lucas. I'm joining my colleague Helen Turner, and we're presenting Shifting the Capstone Studio Online, Living the New Present in Both Academy and Profession. Without giving the end away, we do have a colleague that is fond to remind us to begin with the end in mind. What we're here to tell you is that if you do good design on your course shell, then you'll have the opportunity to slide in various sorts of ways in terms of modes, regardless of what comes at you during the course of the semester. So it's important, I think, to say to all of you that Helen and I have worked together a lot on course curriculum development. We've worked together specifically on the history and theory sequence development, which we completed about 5 years ago. It's a 2-course sequence that we took into hybrid mode from a very traditional and dry version of those history classes. So we've had some in-person experience together, we've had some online experience together, but inherently planning those really sort of shaped how we looked at the Capstone project for the spring semester of 2020, which we're going to tell you about. So our premise for that is, and what we've learned, big long lesson that we've learned, is that it takes really 12 to 18 months minimum to be sure that you have the opportunity to plan the course well and be able to articulate to the students through the various assignments, through the course management system that you might be using, noting that if it's really constructed well, then the students are likely to receive it well, no matter sort of what's happening in the world around them. But as you all know, as all of us know, right, the reality in March of 2020 is that we really had 2 weeks to revise the studio that we'd put together prior to that. So in this presentation, we're not going to talk so much about how we transform the Capstone studio because of COVID, but really about how planning well in terms of course development can result in resilience regardless of the circumstances that you find yourself in.
So some of the ways that we thought about the structure of the studio prior to the pandemic and just setting it up as a way to help students transition to the profession, there's a list of things that we did. And so as Patrick mentioned, this is the Capstone studio, so the last studio in the 8-semester sequence, the last studio that the students would take before they enter the professional world. And so we really wanted to implement things within the structure that would help in that process and aid in that process. And one of the main things that we did, first and foremost, was allow them to select independent projects. So they were able to choose the project type, the project scope, the project location, and this gave them the ability to take a critical look at their portfolio that they had developed so far and find out where there might be something missing, something that they might want to focus on that they hadn't been able to yet, or to think about career goals and what type of project might help shape their portfolio to be able to pursue some of those opportunities. Once we understood what their projects were and the types of projects they were focusing on, we also organized them into cohorts. And so these were groups of peers that we really relied on in terms of feedback and also project development. So we would have a hospitality group, or we might have a healthcare group. Really, these groups were focused on similar project types because we recognized that as the faculty member, even though we were there to give approval, we were also there to give feedback on what it was that they were doing. We also knew that we were not experts in everything that they might be focusing on. So we really wanted to encourage them to become the experts and then to rely on one another when it came to feedback and when it came to also development, so that they might be researching something that would be very applicable to something that their peer had found as well, so that they could rely on one another and start to share some of the work that they were doing. So within this process, we also provided them a schedule that had really key deadlines and touch points, but then allowed them to be very self-paced within those major points. So they could determine the ways in which they work best. They could start to figure out what their own process was, but we still had those touch points along the way to make sure that they were progressing and doing the things that they needed to do to be successful at the completion of the studio. They also were able to negotiate their individual deliverables. So again, recognizing that they were using this as an opportunity to sort of round out their portfolio or look towards their future career goals, we wanted them to be able to determine how they best communicated their design work and their design ideas. And so we allowed them to do things that were potentially non-traditional. So they were able to do the traditional drawings, they were able to do renderings, finish boards, those types of things. But we also encouraged written narrative. We encouraged storytelling. We encouraged different types of conceptual exploration. And so we really allowed them to sort of talk with us about what they thought was appropriate for their project, for them as a designer, and for their portfolio and their goals. We also required that their research agenda align with the school themes. So our school has different themes related to community, to sustainability, and various aspects of design that as a school holistically we find important. And so we really encourage them to align their projects with this to make sure that it had some grounding and relevancy within the field as a whole. So again, these sort of connected to theories and bigger ideas around those sorts of things, and also connected back to some of the things they had learned earlier in the program. We have an environmental theory course. Patrick has mentioned the history and theory course. And so as this was a capstone studio, we really wanted them to reflect on some of the things that they had learned earlier in the program and bring that to bear in their studio projects as well, to provide a little bit of consistency, but also to ensure that they were meeting the rigor necessary for a capstone studio. We required that they have existing building shells. We didn't want them spending the time designing a shell and fenestration and a structural system. But we really wanted them to be able to focus on what they were doing on the interior and with the spaces within that shell, and that they had to at least have 10,000 square feet. Beyond the projects, some of the things that we thought were really important and impactful for the students, again, thinking about the professional world, we required them to develop a committee that is beyond the faculty in the school. So they had to reach out to experts who were doing some of the work that they were interested in, whether it was design or whether it was someone related. So for instance, we had a student who was interested in designing a center for veterans. And so she actually worked with and reached out to the director of Veterans Affairs here on campus. So those were some of the types of people that we asked them to reach out to and to engage, because we knew, again, we are not experts in all of the project types that they were focusing on, but that they really needed to begin to develop a network and understand how to work with people to think about their design in a more impactful way. To augment all of these studio approaches, again, they were all very different. We have a travel component embedded in our program. And so we had planned to travel to Washington, D.C. to give them time to explore different types of buildings, to help generate ideation, or to help them think about how they might incorporate some things that exist into their own studio projects. And then last but not least, we thought of the end of the semester as a presentation, somewhat in a traditional sense where they might have boards, but ultimately we also required that they submit to us actual portfolio pages. So again, this was a way we were thinking about the studio as a method to help round out their portfolio and help them transition into the profession. So that was something we thought was extremely important.
So if you can cast your minds back with us, it's basically a year ago from the date that we recorded this presentation that we began hearing rumors that campus was changing the way that it was going to be doing its work. So the first thing that happened on our campus is that the president suspended all travel for everyone. And then the announcement came quickly that classes would be moving on session. This timing was just before our spring break. So we were to use the week before spring break and the week of spring break as the teaching faculty to try to get courses in better shape relative to students coming back online fully after spring break had concluded. So one of the things that we recognized pretty quickly was that having had this online sort of curriculum experience before, is that we needed to maybe vary some of the things that we're going to do online and be able to sort out ways for smaller groups of students to get together. We'll naturally return to the existing cohorts that have been established that Helen told you about around those specific topics, and we were able to think about how we might leverage the power and energy of those smaller groups of students together to be able to have the opportunity for them to support one another, even if they were online. We recognized quickly there was a lot of information coming out from the university about health and wellness relative to students, not only theirs, but ours as well. And so we thought it merited adding an assignment as a transition time back from the canceled spring break, to be able to have students to sort of take a breath and tell us about like where they were, where they'd landed, whether that was still in Lexington where UK is, or had gone back home somewhere in Kentucky or somewhere beyond, kind of what their circumstances were relative to how things were going to be online for them, and trying to cope with their worlds the best way that we could. So that moment for mental health and wellness, I thought, was pretty critical to be able to help students recognize that we were there to support them as they move through their final semester and the final studio of the course sequence at our school. Keeping in mind, of course, the transition to the profession is really what the studio is all about, no matter when it's taught, in terms of the pandemic or not. But we found one of the most valuable sessions was a two-on-one session that Helen and I were having with a student who was asking lots of questions about what's going to happen with the job market and how's this going to work. And we just sort of naturally responded to her inquiries. And at the end of that conversation, I said to Helen, we need to have that conversation, same one with the whole class. So we scheduled some time to do that because we thought that was important, and really probably first and foremost in many of these students' mind in terms of what was going to happen even the next month or the next 2 months or the next year. So we were able to be able to leverage the experience that we had had relative to that. And then following this final presentations that Helen mentioned, the notion that we were going to have portfolio pages come in and some additional collateral, really sort of thinking about that, flipping that sort of spin to be sort of the notion of a sustainable practice relative to that. And also modeling a lot of what happens in design firms right now is that there's a lot of sharing across digital means. And so having the students have that experience, I thought was something that we sort of emphasized was pretty important. So we recognize it as a caveat to this whole new president, right? That this probably works for upper level students, upper division students, students who have a lot of sort of self motivation to get finished. May not work with some of your other students, but we'd be willing to hear anything that you have that suggests otherwise.
And one of the things that we thought was also important to share is that we were sort of doing some research on the side about peer learning and peer engagement, as well as virtual modes of learning. And we realized that our structure actually merged with the virtual mode very well. And as Patrick mentioned, it also aligned very much with the professional world. So we're in an increasingly global economy. And specifically within the global context, people were starting to communicate online and jump on a Zoom meeting before getting on a phone a lot quicker and a lot more readily and a lot more comfortably as well. And so we just found that, and also including this with the peer learning, this was really important for helping students transition to the profession. So there are positive impacts and opportunities for nimble remote instruction for studio. There's some research that's been done related to that topic, as well as the way that studio and peer critiques and peer learning can help acculturate students into professional practice, enabling them to better share their ideas, but also to be able to better communicate with their peers and provide critical feedback as well. So they're not just talking well about their own work, but they're also able to talk well about what it is that their peers are doing and provide feedback. That's pretty critical.
So what evolved in terms of the course? So I think first and foremost, as we started the presentation and introduced the two of us and the time that we've spent together in curriculum development, we couldn't have done this studio the way that we did it without the two of us in the mix. And the value and strength of team teaching, I think, for those of you that do it, of course, we're true believers in that sense. In addition to that, we're sort of putting the peers in charge of their own learning, or helping peers help each other in terms of learning was critical in terms of how the course evolved and was able to be resilient, whether it was taught face-to-face or online. So those small topic groups and cohort meetings continued through as a theme. And I think there was some stability there that I think the students appreciated, because they were much more intimately familiar with, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5 other student projects than they were necessarily with what was going on in the rest of the class. And that made it easy to not have to catch everybody up every time that you're making a presentation and get good feedback. Because of our curricular development, Helen and I adopted all that we could in using Canvas the best way that we could. So every course management system has its positives and negatives, but we have found that Canvas actually provides the opportunity to do something that we both heartily believe in, which is to lay out the course in a transparent kind of way so that all the deadlines are there, all the due dates are there, all of the information about each of the projects and assignments that we're going to tackle. That had been done before we went into the pandemic context. So that meant that after the pandemic context came around us, we were able to really make all of those projects and assignments be more or less the same kinds of things. So there wasn't much change for the students in terms of grappling with that because of the mode of instruction. We continued methods of feedback, but moving those online meant a little bit different kind of way of approach it. In the original idea for the studio, Helen and I were both teaching on overload. So she was going to cover one day, I was going to cover the other day. We committed once the pandemic came to really do all of this work together, because it just seemed easier and there was more surety for students that they would get an even sort of even-handed approach. But above all, that good communication and transparency was really what this was about. Um, Helen's going to tell you in just a moment about some of the course evaluations and some of the student thoughts about this particular course. And while there were some comments about, we could have always done better, I think we did a pretty valiant job given the circumstances of letting students know what was coming and communicating the best that we could based on what information that we were getting. So just to remind you again, the premise of this Capstone Studio is that really we're putting students in the driver's seat. That's the metaphor I often use. We're in the driver's ed car and the instructors are over on the other side with the wheel, helping just in case there's going to be an issue. But really at this point in a Capstone Studio, Helen and I are enjoying the ride in the back seat and probably being a little bit of backseat drivers. Hey, you should turn that way. That's going to work out better for you or whatever. So the notion is that student agency was really what was important in terms of this particular Capstone Studio. Timing and scheduling those online meetings became more and more critical because we did find students did have access issues relative to the internet, but zeroing in on a day and time, also emulating what would happen in professional practice. Your meetings at 1:15, your meetings at 1:30, don't be late kind of thing. Those individual conversations were some of the most powerful that we had. And as I said, Helen and I committed to doing those together because we thought that was probably a fairer shake for the students in terms of that. They continued meeting with their external committee members. Mostly they did those one-on-one. Of course, those meetings were virtual as well. But I think what was pretty exciting about that is that I felt like there was a richer opportunity for those committee members to be involved more integrally all through the process and up to the end to the final reviews.
Beyond talking about our perception of what happened and what our intent was, we think it's important to share student outcomes and some of which are our own observations, but some we also heard in the course evaluations that Patrick mentioned. So I'm sure this is true of a lot of people. We noticed that some of the students who actually did well in person lost themselves in the virtual mode, but others who weren't doing well in person actually were able to do better work and to be more engaged when we moved to the online learning. And so this is just something that we feel moving forward. And as we have moved forward into other studios, we needed to pay attention to and understand the ways in which students work and try to meet them in those ways to help them thrive in either scenario. Again, in terms of the course evaluations, the students in general and overall felt that the course was successful. And a lot of them noted that they were able to complete projects not that they were proud of, and also that they could include in their portfolio as an integral piece moving into the professional world and as they went out to pursue jobs. And some students even indicated that we should consider using this structure in the future, whether it was in the middle of a pandemic or not, and even as something that might be considered during face-to-face instruction. So again, thinking about these as senior level students, they have been through a lot of different studios. They are starting to develop their own ways of working. And specifically in the earlier phases of the design process, they found it very beneficial to have the time and the freedom to be able to work when and how they want. So they weren't necessarily constrained to a specific day and time and room in the studio, but they could work the way that they wanted to. And a lot of them found that this was extremely beneficial and worked out very well. So all these things considered in the midst of a pandemic and everything that everybody was going through, we really consider all of these a win. And just thinking about the topic in the new present and the fact that our new present is ever changing and our new present now is not the same as our present when we actually wrote this and when we actually started thinking about this course. And so to tie it back into our original statement and then the way Patrick introduced our presentation, don't lose sight of the forest for the trees, right? We need to think about studio, we need to think about instruction in ways that allow us to be nimble and allow us to change and allow us to be flexible. So we should never try to fit a square peg, a traditional studio, into a round hole like a virtual environment. There are some things that just don't work and just don't fit, but that doesn't mean we need to overhaul everything, right? There are some methods and there are some things, specifically some of the things that we've mentioned today, that are worth maintaining, that can help us provide flexibility or still be flexible while we help our students transition from the academy to practice.
In the end, good design is good design is good design. So regardless of the mode, we feel like studio methodology is malleable and always should remain so. We're not here to advocate any kind of change for that. That absolutely is true. But if you plan well, you can be resilient regardless of the mode that you find yourselves in. And we hope that the presentation has helped you see how we were able to do that in the spring semester of 2002. So as we conclude today, Helen and I would delightfully entertain any conversation that you would like to start by email, or let us know any suggestions that you might make as we continue to improve the Capstone Studio for our students here at the School of Interiors at the University of Kentucky. Helen has gone on to team teach with someone else this spring, so already implementing some of the things that we talked about as successes, even in the crazy context of that pandemic. So thanks again for your time today, and we really appreciate your good thoughts, and stay safe out there.